Dred Scott was a slave who fought for his freedom, inspired many, and inadvertently encouraged the Civil War. Good morning, class of Room 13. My name is Isabelle Cooper, and I will be presenting on the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was an African American slave who filed a suit for his freedom. For over a decade, he fought in a court of law for himself and his family. This single case brought the United States to the brink of war. Shown here is a real photograph of Scott in 1857. Scott was born in the late 1700s in Southampton, Virginia. He was born into slavery under Master Peter Blow. He traveled with the Blow family from Virginia to Huntsville, Alabama to St. Louis, Missouri. In 1831, Blow died and military surgeon John Emerson bought him. Sometime later, Emerson was transferred to the state of Illinois and brought Scott with him. They stayed there for about 2.5 years. Emerson then moved to the Wisconsin Territory in the spring of 1836, again bringing Scott along. It was here that Scott met Harriet Robinson, shown here. They married and had 2 daughters, Eliza and Lizzie Scott. 2 years later, Scott and his family went back to the South with Emerson. In 1843, Emerson died and left his estate to his wife, Irene Emerson. Scott filed his suit for freedom against Ms. Emerson on April 6, 1846. He claimed that his and his family's time in free states and territories should give them their freedom. As you can see on the map, both Illinois and the Wisconsin area were free since 1787, nearly 60 years before Scott filed his case. However, Scott encountered some problems. He was unable to read or write, and he could not afford lawyers to help him win his case. Scott's previous owners, the Blows, considered Scott a friend and supported him financially throughout the trial. In 1846, Scott had his first trial in St. Louis's old courthouse, shown on the right, but he lost. A second trial was granted to Scott in 1850, and the jury felt that Scott and his family should be freed. However, Ms. Emerson did not want to lose her property, so she appealed the case to Missouri State Supreme Court. In 1852, the third trial was held. Once again, Scott lost. Scott hired a new group of lawyers who were completely against slavery for a fourth trial in the St. Louis Federal Court, shown here, in 1853. The court's decision remained that Scott would stay in slavery. After losing 2 consecutive trials, Scott appealed to the United States Supreme Court in 1856. However, 7 of the 9 justices were pro-slavery. On March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, shown on the right, delivered the majority's opinion. The consensus was that Scott would remain a slave, but Chief Justice Taney also added that since Scott was a slave, he was not a citizen and had no right to file a suit under any circumstance. The Missouri Compromise of 1812 was thought of as unconstitutional, and most of the justices believed the government had no right to prohibit slavery. As a result, Northerners were outraged, and anti-slavery groups feared slavery was going to spread. There were meetings, news articles like this one, and protests about the event, and prevention of slavery's further spread. Founded in 1854, the Republican Party wanted to end slavery. To do so, they attempted and succeeded at gaining control of Congress and the courts. In fact, the Dred Scott case led to the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. After the final case, Ms. Emerson ended up marrying a Northerner who was completely against slavery named Calvin C. Chaffee. Mrs. Chaffee then sold Scott and his family to the Blows, who set them free on May 26, 1857. 9 months later, on September 17, 1858, Scott died a free man. The Dred Scott case was a very important part of history. Without this case, Abraham Lincoln may not have been elected, and slavery would have ended years after it did. Although he did not win his freedom within the court, Scott unintentionally helped to develop and fuel the Civil War, and therefore participated in the fall of slavery. Thank you for listening to the story of Dred Scott.